Hello, everyone. Good evening. I am a little bit nervous. Well, my name is Vlad Kolesnikov. I'm the curator of this conference, and the conference is called Research in the Deaf Community. And I work together with another curator, Nikita Bolshikov. So this is the third year that we have the conference. It's an annual event. I'm very happy to see you after a year. And we've had a lot of changes during this year because our team went to Kazan and met the local community of deaf people and studied it. So thanks to this trip, we created a theater project called Momu Act 4. This theater project will be showcased during the last day of the conference, just after the closing ceremony. The project allows us to learn a lot about deaf people, about ourselves, and also to share this knowledge with the community and other people. We believe that it is very important, both in the beginning of the project and now, to work together with the High School of Economics University, because academic knowledge and academic disciplines definitely are a great contribution. And now I'm giving the floor to Irina Matusevich, who is the Vice Rector of the High School of Economics University. Good evening, dear friends. It's a great honor for me to be here, and thank you very much for introducing me. For us as a university, it is a great honor to be your partner, your academic partner for the third time. And it is a very interesting and important project for the society. I'm sure that over the past few decades, we have had a whole range of new knowledge, and it helped us to be more understandable for ourselves and for others. So this is a reason for us to think about ourselves and our place in the society in general. Today, we can see cultural institutions becoming drivers for discussions with various groups of people. As a university, our mission is popularizing this knowledge. And we believe that we definitely need to join such initiatives. And thanks to the research and finding the practices that work very well, we can finally scale up the initiatives. So in many cultural institutions, there are similar events, and we are either partners or participants of such events. So I hope that more and more people will be included in this dialogue. Today, there are about 20 interpreters working at the event, and that is also an important achievement for today. So I would like to thank the colleagues and the organizers, and I wish we have a very fruitful day. Thank you very much. Before we start the plenary session, I would like to say that we have some rules. So there is a QR code on the screen right now, and it leads to a chat bot in Telegram where you can leave your questions and comments. You can also ask any questions on organization. If you have any new comments, or maybe you want to support or say that you're against the point of view that is said, then you can write any kind of comments in the chat bot. Also, you can ask any questions in the chat box, but please do not ask any questions during the event. So if you have any problems with the QR code, we have Diana and Yulia here in the audience. This is Yulia and this is Diana. So if you have any problems, you can ask them to help, and they will help you resolve the issues with the QR code, and then you'll be able to send your question or comment to the chatbot. And now I'm giving the floor to Yelena Yarskaya-Smirnova, who will open the first plenary session.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear friends. I'm very happy that for the third time we're here together having such a great event. And I can say for sure that we all are participants of a new intellectual turn that is performed by the team of Gestu House of Culture, headed by Vlad Kolesnikov and his colleagues. Of course, it's our participation of the High School of Economics, but it's first of all the community, intellectual leaders, and community leaders. And this turn is not simply scientific turn, it's social turn. But you can ask me where? Where do we turn actually? To the right or to the left? Well, I can remember Jacques Derrida, great French postmodernist, who introduced such a notion as philosophical maze. Actually, in philosophical sense, he decided to consider not a direct way from point A to point B, but a maze with multiple entrances and exits. We can experience this, and we're joining a wonderful journey, but in the middle we're not having a monster waiting for us. It's just a metaphor which sometimes is quite scary. What is hiding there in this unknown space, whether it's a monster or not? Of course, we go there together, we search for new paths. Sometimes we get lost, but still, we are bold enough, we cooperate to reconsider these misunderstandings. That's why I believe this turn helps us to move away from stereotypes. We can see lots of them in science as well. Those stereotypes with which deaf studies are facing in Russia, well, this direction has been existing for many years in the world, but it's only evolving and developing in Russia. Today we'll listen to worldwide known scientists from all over the world here during the conference in order to understand what deaf studies is. It's part of the new intellectual movement and self-identification of the community. And the most important notion here is the ethics of co-participation. So, and I'll invite here, I invite all the participants who are present here. We have one online participant. It's Filipa Venada de Souza, PhD and professor of the Research Center for Justice and Governance, University of Minho, Portugal. And here we also see Vlad Kolesnikov, creator of the Deaf Community Programs, Vlad Kolesnikov of VAC Foundation and Gestu House of Culture of Cross-Disciplinary Project Research in the Deaf Community, and Reza, Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics, Vice Department Chair of Department of Foreign Languages and Linguistics of Shiraz University, Iran. Two participants will be offline and one participant is online. Please take a seat. And we're ready to begin. I suggest to begin our session according to our program. Okay, I have a clicker. I'm going to click the slides, and I'll give the floor to our first participants. As I've said, it's Filipa Venada de Souza. Welcome, Filipa.
The floor is yours now. Hello, everyone. How are you? I'm happy to see all of you. So can I start now? Yes, please. I will be clicking the slides, so please let me know when you need the next slide. So first and foremost, I would like to say thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be able to come in person, so I can see you on my computer screen, and I'm very glad to present today. So The topic of my presentation is about the legal framework. I'm from Portugal. It's a European country. Portugal is a very beautiful country. I can't really tell you what the atmosphere and the nature is like. I hope you will have a chance to go to Portugal in person because there are a lot of cultural features, etc. I work at a university and my work is connected to the legal aspects. So for over 8 years, I've been a professor of the law at university. And at the slide, you can see the name of my presentation, Dephology as a Legal Cultural Framework. So as for the term dephology, I will give a definition later. So I noticed that it will be more understandable if I use the practice and the theory and explain how the laws and the rights and culture work in reality, because sometimes in the law there are certain things, but in actual real life of deaf people, these rights might not be realized. So the question is how to improve the rights, especially the rights to culture. It's a topic that isn't discussed a lot, so we always talk about studies and the rights to sign language, but the right to culture is a less researched topic. That is why I decided to study the right to culture and its various aspects. So it's about right to culture and the difference between right to culture and right to sign language. So in the second slide, you can see the term dephology. So dephology is a new term. So there are two signs, deaf and logy. So logy is a science. So it's a science about the deaf. So in sign language, we use two signs to sign dephology. And dephology includes a lot of things. So deaf studies is more like studies from the point of view of the science. It's about the deaf community and how they live and what they face in life. And so at the intersection of law, language, and culture, we have dephology. So this is a term that includes different terms. So dephology is at the intersection of law, language, and culture, and it's like a tree that has different roots that support it. So the next slide is about the term dephology. And this term, dephology, actually, I've been reflecting on the topic of the deaf, and many people study deaf history, deaf culture, and there are a lot of studies that concern the deaf. But I wanted to have an idea of the legal life and political life for deaf people. So what does it mean to be deaf? And I studied various points of view. So from the point of view of disability, from the point of view of terms, how to call deaf people, and also the specific terms that are used. A deaf person is always connected to sign language, but what is sign language? So sign language is a means of communication. So how do deaf people communicate with each other? So this is the interconnection that I wanted to study. And also I wanted to have the understanding of this term. Why and who and how. So the interconnection between all these questions is connected to the deaf community. So that's why I chose this term, dephology. If you translate it literally, it's an interdisciplinary discipline that includes deaf studies and also research in the field of languages and deaf culture and deaf history and laws connected to the deaf. So it's a whole interdisciplinary range, and I wanted to put all these things together and make them applicable to the deaf people so that we would understand the concept of the deaf community fully. I can talk quite a lot about it, but I'd like to focus on this. So right now on the screen, you can see the next slide. And the last line of the slide is presenting the methodology of my research, and it's about interdisciplinarity. So my question to you, for example, is if a deaf person knows their history, the history of his or her family, and also deaf culture, deaf theory, and knows all these things, but how can this person transfer it all to the community on the political level and to the government agencies? How can sign languages be recognized by the law? How to achieve that? And how to study all this? How to collect all the proofs and put them in the documents? So how do we explain to the politicians and to the people in the legal system, the judicial system, how to prove to them that the deaf need the right to their culture, so that the hearing people would recognize the deaf people's right to their culture, and so that they would recognize the importance of the right to sign language. So it's connected to deaf studies. Deaf studies includes a lot of research, academic research, and that really helps the deaf community change the laws. And so bringing together those two approaches, the legal one and the deaf studies one, we have deafology. So now on the slide, you can see the list of rights, the rights of the deaf people. So the deaf people have the right to what? Do they have the right to culture and other rights? So do we recognize the deaf person as deaf, or is a person part of the deaf community if he or she knows sign language? Or do we think about the concept of sign language as a right to language? You can see it in different ways. It's about using the language in the family or by deaf people, and there are a lot of different areas actually. Can you go back to the previous slide, please? So the language rights and the rights to culture are connected. And there are, of course, different theoretical rationales. So the right to language, the right to sign language, and the right to choose a language. Which right is it as a language right, and how should it influence rights to culture? So cultural rights, what does it mean? Do we need to safeguard the culture, to safeguard the identity, the history, the values, to preserve all that? And how is it all connected? Or shall we divide these two rights? Next slide, please. So there are 4 questions on the slide, and these are the 4 main questions of my study. I always kept them in mind in order to gain clarity. So these are these questions. So various countries have different laws, and so I needed to understand how these questions are resolved, and are they parts of the concepts? So do we see this in laws? Is deaf culture reflected in laws? And if it is, then What does it mean that it's mentioned? The government. Does the government care about the deaf culture, or is it neutral? Doesn't it care about the rights of the deaf people? So do the deaf people themselves need to preserve their culture, to lobby? So who does the lobbying actually? The deaf people themselves, or the government, the state? Who needs to care about preserving cultural and linguistic traditions? So that's a question. The next slide is the map of the world, and you can see the countries, as you probably know. You can maybe zoom in on this map, and then you can ask the question, do deaf people have the right to their culture in these countries? Or is it only the recognition of sign languages that has been achieved in these countries? And also, is this right supported by the laws? So I studied the laws of various countries and how it works in all these countries. So for example, take Chile in South America, it's Chile and Brazil. So in Chile and Brazil, there is a division between the right to language and rights to culture. As for Africa, in different charters, there are mentions of cultural rights. I don't know about Russia, actually. I'm not sure if the right to culture is separate. As far as I know, sign language is recognized in Russia. But as for the right to culture, I'm not sure, actually. If you give me this information later, I'll be glad to use it in my research. Next slide, please. As you probably know, there is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and Russia ratified it too. But we've never discussed the actual points, the actual text of the convention. So in Article 21, the convention says that it is important to support and use sign languages. So what kind of support is it? Who needs to support sign language? Is it the state? Is it the government? And how does the state know how to support it and how to help people and what these people need? So the politicians, do they have the clarity? And then it needs to have an influence on languages. So I'm not sure if it was discussed or it was just put in the text of the convention or the laws. Previous slide, please. So in Article 21, it's actually connected to Article 24 very closely. You can see it in red text. So my question is, what is linguistic identity of the deaf? How is it defined in the convention? Actually, the convention doesn't really go into detail. I know that it's universal for all, but can deaf studies tell us what identity is? So in the UN Convention, is there an understanding of what is necessary for deaf studies? These are the kind of questions I reflected on. Next slide, please. So the next article I'm going to discuss is Article 30. Here it also says support of cultural and linguistic identity. So my question is, what does support really mean? Is it funding? Is it providing opportunities for holding events? Is that what they mean? And also, I looked at the laws of various countries, and the question was, how do politicians in different countries understand this article? And in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we have certain examples. But as for Africa, in the African Charter on Human Rights, the concept is defined very clearly. You can see it. You can see how it's realized. So it says very clearly what deaf culture means, and it's all about the deaf history and who needs to support what and what kind of details are there. So this is a good example for everyone, and I think it should be also used for other countries. And in the next slide, just like in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in the African Charter, we have a lot of articles, but the concept of deaf culture is represented separately in the African Charter. So in the African Charter, there is quite a lot of attention on the deaf. So you can also take a look at different other legal documents on this slide. I can speak for a long time about this topic. It's a really interesting topic. And thanks to these documents that you can see on the slide, I understood how the rights on culture are realized. And these 4 documents really help. So I can't give you an example of every single country, but I chose 2 examples of countries to make it more understandable. So if we talk about South Korea, in their laws, there is a concept of identity, and you can see it in red. They have the terms deaf culture and deaf identity, and so deaf culture and deaf identity are 2 different terms in this legislation. And another example in the next slide is Costa Rica. So cultural rights are described in detail here. You can see it in red in the slide. So for example, C, maintain and develop deaf culture. So it needs to be supported and developed. So research of the deaf community needs to be conducted, and also cultural traditions need to be preserved, as well as sign language. So this is written in the legislation. And since it's put in the legislation, the country will need to do what's said in the law. But if the law doesn't mention it, then the government can say, oh, there is no legal framework, we don't need to do this. But here it's said, and it definitely needs to work. So in Costa Rica, it actually works. Next slide, please. So I have mentioned various legal norms and laws, and the question is, how do they influence the rights and the realization of the rights? Globally, there are not as many countries that use the strategies in their policies. And if the strategies are there, then if it says development, if the strategy doesn't really correspond to the policy of a country, then it means that it wasn't realized. So for example, on this slide, we have Britain, Spain, and the World Federation of the Deaf. Sorry, we need to go to the previous slide. So the World Federation of the Deaf has a lot of leaflets, and you can understand how it should be implemented. Next slide, please. I will now briefly tell you what we have on this slide. If in the legislation you do have the cultural rights mentioned, then you can achieve the implementation of the rights. So it shouldn't be just a theory, but it needs to be put in detail and described in detail, and deaf culture needs to be defined. And if it's done, then the deaf community will be supported. And the next slide is about preserving the vitality. It's really important to preserve the vitality. And there are three ways for that. First, it's participation in the cultural life of a society. So, I mean, any kind of events, any kinds of conditions. Participation needs to be provided. The second point is access to cultural life, to cultural events. And the third point is a possibility of giving a contribution. I mean, the deaf people having the possibility of giving a contribution to cultural life. And if deaf people have this right, then the vitality will definitely be preserved and even developed. And in my final slide, you can see 4 squares. Deaf culture needs to be defined very clearly in the policy, in the cultural policy of a country. And cultural support also needs to be described in detail. Deaf culture needs to become part of the school curriculum so that people would know about deaf identity. And it's also really important to preserve and defend the deaf culture. And so representatives of the state and the community need to have connections between themselves. So these 4 points will help preserve deaf culture and its vitality. Thank you very much. Thank you. I hope that I managed to get across the points. I didn't have much time. Thank you very much. People are applauding. So, Felipe, thank you very much for your presentation. It's a topic that definitely concerns everyone because the legal aspects of deaf culture is a very new area and it's new for Russia as well. So please stay with us. The session of questions and answers will be in the very, very end of the section. So I will now present the next presentation. So Vlad Kolesnikov will now present and he will talk about the community of co-authors, production and distribution of knowledge on the deaf in Russia.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So the project Researching the Deaf Community, for us, it's a project that we've been working on for 3 years. It's a major project, and it suggests trips to various cities with our team. We publish an almanac. The first one was published last year. The second one, you already have it, and that's wonderful. In this almanac, there is an introduction that I wrote together with Nikita Bolshakov. And now my presentation will be based on this text. This introduction tells us about who researches the deaf community these days in Russia, and also about the fact that people who research the community have various perspectives and approaches to the research. And it's important for us that this work is done together with deaf individuals, not without them. And Yelena has already mentioned today that deaf studies in Russia, we don't have the specific Russian sign for that. We borrowed the international sign. So in Russia, there is no equivalent to deaf studies, and there is no correct translation in Russian. That's why we suggest using the term researching the deaf community. This is research that aims at researching the community, and that's what we call deaf studies. There is no single direction. It's a multidisciplinary direction that includes knowledge and culturology, education, teaching, and we mean that education is much wider than simply teaching. It's a cross-disciplinary knowledge, discipline that includes multiple sciences. And as Elena said today, deaf studies is a very young discipline direction in Europe. In Europe, it exists for a long while. Probably when we in 2022 launched this project, our first aim was to research this approach, to spread knowledge about it. But we always have a question whether previously no one investigated the deaf community. We understand that all through the 20th century we had this research, and these days there are also such research of the deaf community, but what's the perspective in it? What are the goals? Well, support, help, inclusion to the community of hearing people. And of course, these are research in the field of education and pedagogy. It's neither good or bad, it's just a fact. And it used to be like that, but now I'd like to say a couple of words about the concept of deafness. I don't have a specific sign for the concept. Well, maybe notion, meaning, but I'll use this sign similar to direction. Well, a deaf person was perceived as a person with partial hearing loss, and it's not bad, it's just a medical concept, such an approach. And the right of parents to make their child, let's say, conventionally healthy, close to the norm, that was perceived as healing a person with certain impairments. I'm from a deaf family. My parents are deaf. Until I was 7, everyone thought that I was a hearing person. I went to a regular kindergarten, to a regular school, and when I went to the first class, I often re-asked my teacher, asked many questions, and it was not a regular interaction between a pupil and a teacher. And when my teacher noticed that, she said that my parents should bring me to the doctor, and that's when I faced the medical approach for the first time. I was in hospital. I got, let's say, a medical note. Probably you had similar experience before. I got a medical note, sort of an expertise, and I got a disability status. I had to reapprove this status every year. Well, my partial hearing loss was not curable, but that's basically what a medical approach is. But that's how I could perceive myself as a person with partial hearing loss, and that was explicitly written in my medical note. But there is another approach, cultural approach, which suggests that a person is perceived not as a person with hearing impairments, but as an individual with specificities. So let's say a person who has a different identity, cultural identity, certain behavioral patterns. Let's say we arrange ourselves in circles to communicate, so it's cultural concept of perception of a person is similar to how society perceives us. But well, in cultural concept, a person is perceived not as a specific individual, but as a part of community. And speaking about the community, who are members of this community and who are not? And whether hearing people are part of this community, whether our parents of a deaf child, whether they are part of the community, whether they should learn sign language or not, people who interact with deaf people, whether they are part of this community. Well, this list you can see on the slide is not comprehensive. It can be supplemented all the time, but when speaking about the deaf people, I'll mean all the categories listed on the slide. Not only deaf people, but also those people who identify themselves and link themselves with traditions of this community. Also, for me, at a certain point, this notion was very important. Epistemology. Well, we agreed that together with the interpreter that we'll use like this sign to denote this word, the first letters. It's our way of forming knowledge, new knowledge, and scientific knowledge as well. For example, it might rain in the street. And now, can you see that it rains in the street? Probably you hear the drops of rain falling down. Some of you see it. We can hear a person who comes in wet clothes, and we understand. We can see the weather forecast. Well, yes. You get involved in this interaction. I get some responses from the audience. We get knowledge this way, but how do deaf people get access to knowledge? So let me give you an example. For example, in a school, there was a psychological diagnostic carried out by a local school psychologist, and kids had to draw their family. A girl drew a family with her, a parent, and a mother and a father. And both her parents had very huge hands, and psychologists thought that she was harassed in the family. Probably her parents beat her, but probably the perspective might be different. Hands are very important for her because her family communicates with her using hands. And when we use this different approach perspective to the problem, we understand that this community has specific experience, and we get much wider scope of knowledge if we consider it from this cultural perspective, not from the medical perspective. Thomas Kuhn suggested a new notion, deaf epistemology. And this notion means this epistemology that it takes into account deaf epistemology when the researcher understands, is aware of this existence of this medical concept and cultural concept, when we take into account the culture of the deaf. So it's important to know that one deaf person cannot be responsible for the entire society. Or can. What do you think about that? Of course, all deaf people are different, and their experience is different, the same as with the hearing people, because every hearing person is specific and individual, the same as any deaf person. And I'd like to ask you a question. For example, a researcher who researches deaf community. So we slightly changed the left and the right. So we have a hearing and a deaf researcher. Who is more trustworthy, actually, as a researcher? Thanks a lot for your responses. Actually, I believe that everyone would say that the deaf person, but you actually have 50-50 responses. Actually, deaf people have various level of expertise and knowledge, and the opinion of a single deaf individual cannot be considered as the opinion of an entire community. It's not a comprehensive list. There might be many more researchers with various research experience. So, which problems might arise with the hearing person who wants to investigate the deaf community? Of course, you won't know the culture, sign language, and it might be an obstacle to penetrate the society, so they need an agent who would help them carry out this research. And I like Rodriguez's words, who on the 14th of October mentioned that hearing people would always continue investigating and researching sign language and deaf community because they're interested in this phenomenon, and it's neither good or bad, it's just a fact, and we accept it. But it's important that next to a hearing researcher, there is a guide, a deaf guide. There might be various deaf individuals with various expertise and research experience. Thus, hearing researcher can penetrate this deaf community, study language and culture. They will be more accessible to him. And the second problem a hearing researcher might have consists in the fact that the knowledge they get while researching the deaf community, for example, deaf people who have no implants, he will research them, he'll get their expert opinion, and he will think that there are no deaf people wearing hearing aids. Then he'll give a talk at the conference, let's say, and there will be no deaf individual who would object to this knowledge into this outcome. Usually during the academic discourse, there is no translation to the sign language. And if you researched the community, you should bring this community back, this knowledge back to the community and have some feedback from the experts. And it's also important to say that next to the hearing researcher, there is not just an agent from the deaf community who can bring respondents for a poll, for example, bring some piece of knowledge. It's important that the deaf person is capable to correct the hearing colleague so that they work on the equal basis and carry out the research together and took into account the specificity of the deaf community in the sign language. You know that deaf people don't like polling. Actually, many people don't like it. And if we ask deaf people to just, or any person to fill out a questionnaire, it will be very formal. Whether these questions will be translated into sign language, or we should introduce some specific wordings for these questions. There should be an element of using sign language in these questionnaires and polls to make this polling easier for deaf people. Probably there are deaf people who don't know sign language, so that the deaf person should be able to comment on how to carry out this research and which methods to use for that to get correct responses. I've already mentioned that research should be carried out together, the hearing and the deaf participants, and they should be split at the initial stage so that each researcher could influence the way the research is carried out, who's included in the sampling. For example, I can say I need 15 deaf people, and my colleague says, let's say, okay, there should be 15 users of hearing aids, 15 users of cochlear implants, etc. It's very important when we carry out the research and when we get the results, have some data, analyze it, and then interpret it. We start analyzing it. There should be also a deaf person who understands how to interpret and analyze this data, who knows the representatives of this expert community. It's important to bring this knowledge back to the community. Here at the conference, we would be very happy to have some feedback from you, some feedback about the research we performed, despite your position, regardless of it, regardless of your approach. Of course, there are parents who bring their kids and choose medical concept for themselves. It's just important to get the feedback. And of course, the research carried out by hearing people, by deaf researchers, it's not only within the framework of cultural approach, they might be different, but it's important to have a deaf researcher included in this research. And they should create some sort of a history of this community. It's important to involve deaf people in the creation of this history, allowing us to make it more clear and reliable. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Vlad. And we move on. We are checking for questions from you. You can send them to chatbot. There is a QR code there, and you can send your questions to this bot. I'm sorry, dear colleagues, I had to announce the main concepts and complicated notions in this presentation. In the first presentation, there were notions of deafology and epistemology, which was described by Vlad in great detail. And deaf studies is an often used notion. Reza Rizvani is our next speaker. Will use this notion epistemology, but he will also use the notion of deprivation and marginalization. Dear colleagues, dear participants, Riza Rizvani will present in English. Probably you need to take tour guides if you need translation into Russian. So please welcome Riza. We give you the floor. Semiotics, another notion actually. Semiotics of selfhood, Iranian Sign Language and the deaf linguistic identity, deaf epistemology and deaf epistemic agency. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my privilege to be here to present a paper at this well-organized conference. From the early time in the morning, I learned a lot from the conference before the presentation starts. So I will continue attending the presentations to learn more about some new concepts about deaf studies. My presentation today is about the semiotics of selfhood, which is an answer to some of the questions raised in the former presentations. My presentation is a report of the development of a framework, which, as I told you, answers some of the questions, critical questions about deaf studies. More specifically, my presentation today is going to explore the critical role of Iranian Sign Language, or in a sense, any sign languages, in shaping the identity, epistemology, knowledge, core knowledge, and also agency, or more specifically, epistemic agency of the deaf community. To frame this presentation and also the framework I developed, you should know that this is the report of a conceptual paper examining Iranian Sign Language as the core of linguistic identity, as I told you, deaf epistemology and epistemic agency among Iranian deaf and hard of hearing signers. And the very central thesis my framework revolves around is the position that the modality specific semiotic tools of ISL and its vital, spatial, and kinesthetic features generate unique epistemologies that challenge universalist assumptions about cognition. By universalist assumption, I mean the oralist assumptions centering around the inclusion and accommodation of only spoken languages for the deaf community. And the very central problem my framework and this presentation addresses is the very marginalization of ISL in the formal schooling, is the position that the marginalization of ISL in formal schooling is not merely a pedagogical oversight, but constitutes a systemic epistemic justice by denying the DHH learners the primary means by which they conceptualize and communicate knowledge. In the development of this framework, I synthesized and incorporated three main theoretical positions and perspectives. The first of which is that of Vygotsky, which tells us that language is a psychological tool or mediational means that fundamentally transforms cognitive processes. The modality of this tool, in this case the visual, spatial, kinesthetic modality of ISL, directly shapes the nature of the thinking it mediates. The second perspective, theoretical perspective, we build on is that of Bernstein, which distinguishes between elaborated codes and the restricted codes. In this framework, we argue that oral Persian or any oral spoken languages function as a restricted code for DHH learners, while ISL aligns naturally with the cognitive profiles of an elaborated code. And the third perspective we build on in the development of this framework is that of deaf epistemology. We all know after these two presentations that deaf epistemology is a way of knowing that relies on deaf communities, testimonies, experiences, and visual learning. It centers the unique epistemic orientations arising from deaf experiences and transmitted through sign languages, not spoken languages. The very central position we have taken in the development of this framework is that linguistics has long established the sign languages as a full natural languages with complete phonology, morphology, and syntax. And beyond communication, sign languages are the primary vehicle for cultural transmission and identity formation with the deaf community, within the deaf community. When this sign language is restricted, there would be a conflict, which is defined and called by Regan as the tension between ethic perspective, ethic, and emic constructions of deafness. And this leads to the marginalization of ISL as a separate identity defining the deaf community. Let's be more clear about deaf epistemology and sociocultural mediation. As I defined it before, this is a way of knowing that relies heavily on the deaf community's personal experiences and way of communication. The central concept in ISL or any sign languages is its modality, which is the visual spatial modality of sign languages. And extending the Vygotskian perspective on this dichotomy of position, we come to an understanding that when the mediating language is a visual spatial system like ISL, the modes of internalization, representation, and problem solving differ in a structured ways from those mediated by spoken languages. So, when deaf community and individuals from deaf community are trapped in a restricted code in the context of education, there would be an educational mismatch and problem. The mainstream education's reliance on oral languages like Persian or Farsi functions as a restricted code for DHH learners. We have this understanding from Bernstein's dichotomy. Without full perceptual access, meaning remains under-specified, creating a barrier to abstract knowledge, which is essential for the deaf community. Conversely, if we incorporate and accommodate ISL as an elaborated code by instructing the deaf community through their own sign language, we will encode relationships explicitly in visual spatial forms, making conceptual structures transparent, and we will facilitate learning for the community of deaf. And the general implication, which is the position of my presentation in this paper, is that treating ISL as a full linguistic code is necessary for equal educational participation. Before moving to the components of my framework, I would like to make a number of critical concepts clear. The first of which is epistemic agency, which is in a sense relevant to the former presentations. This is the capacity of individuals to pose questions to general knowledge and set epistemic standards for themselves. And we are reminded by Rader that this is not an individual capacity, but it is decentralized, emerging from collective participation in knowledge systems rather than isolated. And as far as the deaf community is concerned, sign languages like ISL mediate this agency through dialectal interactions in society. Where ISL is valued, deaf people can frame problems, critic wisdom, and produce community-grounded knowledge, which is closely tied to epistemic agency, knowledge agency. Establishing these theoretical positions, and now I would like to turn your attention to a specific context I come from, the Iranian context. The reality of this context is that there is systematic neglect of ISL. The education system primarily supports auditory methods as incorporated and encouraged by the medical model. And lip reading will be encouraged, providing inadequate support for ISL in schools. And this is the finding arising from another study. We came to an understanding that this problem, this reality of the neglect of ISL is accounted for and explained by a pervasive ableist attitude in education. DHH learners frequently encounters a lack of awareness and accommodations for their visual learning needs, effectively positioning them as others. This is one of the themes and main findings we came to in another study. That was the very concept of othering the deaf community in the context of education. The problem will be compounded by the language deprivation. Over 90% of the deaf children in that context are born to hearing families, leading to delayed first language acquisition, that is, that of ISL, and language deprivation. So there will be profound consequences, linguistic and epistemic, leading to epistemic marginalization or epistemic injustice. One of the problems that we encountered in our society is that incomplete access to semiotic resources in ISL and Persian creates barriers to knowledge formation and interaction, leading to poor educational outcomes in various fields of education. It is usually the case that, as far as the deaf community is concerned, the problems of individuals in education in different fields of study is usually attributed to the difference they have, to the hearing conditions. But in actuality, the problem arises from denying access to ISL, which is the main channel of acquiring knowledge. For example, as far as the context of third language acquisition or English language acquisition for this community is concerned, according to the finding from my another study, DHH EFL learners report significant struggles with English grammar and communication, often linked to their fractured foundation in a first language, that is ISL. And this will directly and closely undermine their epistemic agency. Without a fully internalized first language, the development of dialogic thinking and higher order cognitive functions is compromised. We also understand this basic tenet from Vygotsky's perspective that language defines and will be a channel to the thought development. Despite the problems in incorporation and accommodation of ISL in our context, ISL persists to work as an anchor for the deaf community in Iran. ISL functions, in my context, as a natural language with its own grammar, often being used more effectively than Persian among deaf individuals, but in informal context. Since we are short of time, I move on to the very theoretical framework I developed. As I told you before, my theoretical framework is founded on 3 pillars. The first of which is that of Vygotsky, which tells us language as a mediating tool to develop thought. The second is that of Bernstein telling us or giving us a binary division between elaborated code and restricted code, and the last of which is deaf epistemology. This is the schematic representation of my framework. As you see, the central component is ISL with its modality, semiotic affordances, or potentials. Their central role is typically supported by code alignment, which provides the justification of the accommodation and inclusion of this potential from ISL, and it is supported by institutional and social supports, providing the very structural, however, this central component should be accommodated in education. And the last component, as an enabler component, is that of educational access. When ISL is accessible for the deaf community in the formal education, this will provide provisions for the accommodation of the affordances of this mediating mechanism. And this mediating mechanism itself will be the pathway to develop into epistemic agency by developing questioning, knowledge production, and authority of the deaf community. This itself leads to deaf culture, which was of interest in many presentations today and also in the program. This development of deaf culture and identity will lead to the empowerment of the deaf community. And in turn, this cycle will revolve by supporting the enablers again. Have I got enough time to go to the details of the component? 5 minutes. It seems that I can't go to the details of these components. As I tell you, the three first components are the enabler components or activators, activating the very potentials of ISL in the context of education. They together will give us a synergistic relationship. Code alignment provides the essential theoretical foundation. Institutional and social supports create the necessary structural backbone, and educational access serves as the active mechanism that brings theory and support to life in the classroom. As I told you before, and as I depicted in the schematic representation of the framework, these lead to the very central component. That is the very ISL, or sign language, which itself leads to the development of a pathway for internalization of the cognitive process as argued by Vygotsky. And these together will lead to the other components, the epistemic agency and community knowledge production as the direct transformative outcomes of the enablers and mediation of ISL. Before moving on, I need to pause to make a point about the centrality of the role of ISL again. The proposed framework is not merely a sequence of components, but an articulation of a causal and constitutive pathway where ISL is the indispensable active component, and while the model includes essential enabling conditions, in essence, code alignment, institutional supports and educational access, and vital outcomes, it is crucial to emphasize that ISL itself is the central generative mechanism. The very framework and the very position that for the deaf community ISL plays a critical central role will lead to some profound implications for both research and policy. I go over these recommendations and implications. Early and sustained access to ISL's visual spatial modality will be positively associated with enhanced visual spatial reasoning and metacognitive awareness, distinct from a spoken language fostered cognition. This is out to Vygotsky mainly. And instructional approaches that treat ISL as an elaborated code, according to Bernstein, will yield significantly higher gains in conceptual understanding and academic achievement compared to restricted Persian medium instruction. Perhaps this is the answer to the very question that the deaf community's achievements in the context of education is significantly lower than the comparable students' achievement in education. They are denied access to epistemic agency, and this lack of epistemic agency naturally and typically leads to lower achievements. The use of ISL in formal and informal learning settings will be a strong predictor of epistemic agency, measurable through increased self-advocacy and participation in community knowledge production. And the strength of institutional supports, like trained deaf teachers, will significantly moderate the relationship between ISL access and positive epistemic outcomes. And as far as the policies are
И
concerned,
что
our
касается
general recommendation is
политики,
that
наша общая
we need to move
рекомендация,
beyond
нам нужно
pedagogical adjustments
не
or
только смотреть на
differentiated instruction
педагогические подходы, Okay, I was emphasizing the very recommendation or overarching recommendation
as supported by this framework. That is, the necessity of moving beyond pedagogical adjustments or differentiated instruction in the context of deaf education to more transformative institutional change. And more specifically, I have developed a number of key recommendations. Official recognition of ISL as an official language of instruction for deaf students. Currently, as far as my context is concerned, there are denied this recognition of deaf students' sign language as an official language for instruction. And we need national implementation of bilingual, bicultural education, as also emphasized in the first presentation. We need also investment in training and certifying deaf teachers and ISL interpreters. At the moment, we lack trained teachers when it comes to teaching deaf communities. We need also development of deaf-led curricula and pedagogical materials that leverage ISL's modality. In the first two presentations, there was a guiding principle that is nothing about us without us. So this recommendation is concerned with that and incorporates that general principle that we need co-designing. We need the deaf community to be directly and closely involved in the creation of materials and the design of curriculum. And public education campaigns are needed to combat ableism and promote deaf culture awareness. Such investigations are vital to dismantle the overt and covert ableism that DHH students routinely face. This also comes from my another publication about ableism in the context of deaf community education. And in closing, I just go over my central position that ISL is the indispensable semiotic core of deaf identity, cognitive development, and epistemic agency of deaf community in Iran. And perhaps we can extrapolate this general position to other contexts of deaf community. And these are the references I built on to create that conceptual framework. And in the end, I do appreciate for taking your time and attention. Thank you, everybody.
I'm really sorry. I can see that in our chat, in our Telegram channel, we do have questions, but please, you can ask more questions here too. The first question is to Filippo. Nikita asks this question: what exactly we can do to fix this right to the culture in laws?
With my own question.
Okay, thank you for this important question. We should first clarify that we need three steps. First, we need to see which problems exist in law these days. Secondly, we need to understand which laws can protect particularities and deaf culture. And the third step it depends on how you define the deaf culture and on your knowledge of this culture. So these three steps are essential, and based on the all collected evidence, you can make changes to the legislation. So the most important and first step necessary for the deaf community, all the knowledge about signs and identity should be brought together and share this knowledge to other communities and to compare how other communities realize their rights in this country, then you can accept and recognize sign language. Then you need to start a discussion. We need to consider differences between countries if you know which problems the deaf community has, know where they don't have access. For example, if you face discrimination, if you face problems in education, you need to improve that. First, you need to understand where your problem comes from. Studying laws, legislation, we need to understand how to change things for the better. It's a simple example. If we take a deaf person who's treated as a person with some impairments, or we consider him as a deaf individual, it's not easy to understand how deaf people perceive themselves. And, for example, understand the link between deaf people and those who are responsible for establishing these norms, you'll find the solution. Filippo, thanks a lot. Here is another question from our speaker. Rizal, please, you can ask your question to Filippo.
I just need some elaboration on the very law-making and policy-making. Don't you think that policy-making comes before law-making? Can we enforce the society to recognize the rights of the deaf community by law or making laws or legislation? Which one comes first? Culture awareness or enforcing the society to accept a law? That's the question.
Yes, it's quite a frequent question. The first,
I hope that this is not an egg and chicken question.
deaf people should first understand what they want and what they need. They should first explain and then collect all this information, collect all the requirements. They should have good connection with political leaders and work together with these leaders. They should start working on the development, and then it will depend on the system of legislation in your country. First, you can use your constitutional rights or the legal basis. It depends on a specific country. But we need to highlight that a deaf person has the right to their identity and legal rights and freedoms, the rights to the language, to education, and should have access to education. And also, once again, important the right to this language. We need to find all these wordings. If you have a clear wording, it will be much easier for you to stand up for your rights, even within the legal system, because without clear wordings, you won't be able to object against the violation of your rights in court. It's important for this procedure. You should first understand what the community of the deaf needs. And we understand that many deaf individuals need lots of things, but first they need to understand what can help them to solve their problem and what exactly they want to change. The problem is the problem in law or in policy of your country. It's usually not the problem in the law, but in the procedure. Poor knowledge of how laws are developed, it's the problem I believe it's a good answer to your question. Dear friends, we have 3 more questions in the chat, and please I'll ask our speakers to be more brief because we're running out of time. So the question is from freelancer Agnia Rinhe, to speaker Vladislav Kolesnikov, how a hearing individual can be introduced to the deaf culture properly.
This is the answer to the question I raised as well. The question leads to an answer, which was the answer I solicited.
How a hearing person can correctly learn something about the deaf culture? Probably more communication, not be afraid of the first meeting, and be ready that there might be certain complications during communication, but the opinion of a single deaf individual is only his or her personal opinion, and no one can be responsible for the entire community. Actually, I don't have a clear instruction for that. When hearing people meet deaf people, I believe everyone has their own experience during a meeting.
Can I further ask a question? How about
Yes, now I just follow the order of getting questions, and it's once again question to Filippo. Can you, Filippo, please be brief because we are running out of time and there are many, many questions here. The question is to you, an interesting lecture. How did you define, based on the map of the all-world association of the deaf, how did you understand where there are where the World Federation of the Deaf is? I'll try to be brief. Here is a convention on the rights of the disabled people. It gives good opportunities for the implementation of the rights of the deaf, but do people really understand what's the implications of this convention? Do they understand what it is about? I believe there are better practices, the best practices all around the world in many different countries, but I think here is a good example. South America is a great example. I believe the best legislation system is there from the perspective of legal norms and regulations, but there is a flip side. It depends on particularities of every specific country. I believe I was brief. Thanks a lot. And next 2 questions to you, Reza. The first question, how long ago bilingual educational methodology for the deaf was introduced? Are there statistic research that proves that bilingual education is more efficient compared to oral methods?
Okay, as far as I know, I'm not aware of any statistical evidence telling us that this bilingual, bicultural education is more effective for the deaf community. At the moment, with the assistance of a couple of my PhD students, are working on translanguaging, which is effectively focusing on the same thing. But if we work on and benefit from this potential of the deaf community in the context of education, their performance will be effectively better or not. We know that the deaf community are really marvelous, remarkable in knowing several languages. I tried around 20 years to learn English, but most people in the deaf community already know a couple of languages. So this is a great potential, And at the moment, as I told you, we are doing research in a translanguaging research to know whether this potential can be benefited, leveraged for the benefit of the deaf community to learn languages or not. This is an example.
Thanks a lot. You actually did not mention how long ago this bilingual methodology was introduced in Iran. How long ago? When did you start using this bilingual methodology in Iran?
I'm not using this methodology formally or informally in education. I have just started, initiated to see whether, if it is introduced in the education, it can be effective for the deaf community or not. Otherwise, I did not teach, I did not develop any bicultural or bilingual education for the deaf community. We have just started it as a research agenda, research problem.
Thanks a lot, Reza. Another question to you from Plash Yelena. Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for your presentation. Who should be responsible for the supervision over the educational system and interpretation into sign languages in institutions of higher education? My colleagues come to classes and don't get any interpretation to Russian Sign Language, and they're in total linguistic deprivation. There are no interpreters in universities, and there are lots of hours of insufficient education for deaf students at universities.
At the very least, you were lucky to live in Russia in comparison to Iran. At the moment, we haven't got those interpreters and experts of sign languages. We haven't got these interpreters. Today, I have heard that you have interpretation studies and sign language majors, and these are missing, these are lacking in our educational system. Put apart the higher education. I was one of the pioneering researchers working on the deaf study. So from this fact, you will understand how unlucky the deaf community in my context is. Otherwise, I'm aware of the fact that interpreters are needed in the educational context, closely because of the point I raised in the development of that framework. If we deny access to interpreters, if we deny access to the use of that extensive and elaborated code of the deaf community, that is the sign language, one way or another, we are in a sense depriving their epistemic agency. So we can't blame the deaf community's lack of enough achievements in academia. They are talented, they have great potentials. As I tell you, they already know a couple of languages, sometimes multiple languages. And the problem can be assigned to the very lack of interpreters and the recognition of, as raised by the other presenter, the recognition of the right of the deaf community to use the sign language as the medium of communication and the medium of instruction in higher education or pre-university education.
Thanks a lot, Reza. And the next three questions are to Vlad.
So Vlad, this is a question from Maxim Zaitsev. As a researcher, as a participant of the deaf community, do you see a conflict between the two approaches to deafness, the medical one and the cultural one? So either we can try to eliminate impairments or accept deafness as cultural identity, but following both concepts at the same time seems problematic. I think that this is a very good question. Thank you very much for asking. If we look at different academic texts about the deaf and hard of hearing people, most of those texts were written in accordance with the medical approach. And very rarely the deaf community is seen from the socio-linguistic point of view as a cultural concept. And the research is mostly in the field of education, and at the same time, can we bring together both concepts? Well, I am part of the deaf community. I have a hearing aid and I use sign language, but at the same time, all those studies about me are mostly about to which extent I am rehabilitated, to which extent I can talk and communicate to the hearing people, and to which extent I'm integrated into the society. But how comfortable am I in the deaf community? Well, this question isn't asked. So I'm okay with hearing people, but I'm very comfortable with deaf and hard of hearing people. I do use a hearing aid, so I can be integrated in the society of the hearing people. Last year, the team called Research in the Deaf Community talked about 4 types of identity of a deaf person, including bicultural identity, which means that you are part of both 2 cultures, the deaf culture and the culture of the hearing people. But there are not that many studies, either pedagogical or medicinal, about this topic. So if it's a magical concept and the research will be carried out, including the deaf community, I don't know, maybe it will work. I will give another example, sorry for taking the time. So as for the psychology of the deaf community, there was one psychologist who studied the topic of the loneliness of deaf people, and so there is no diagnostic really. So methodology exists, and you need to use the methodology, you follow the instructions. Well, I'm not going too deeply into this topic, but briefly speaking, this is probably important, most important, that both deaf and hearing researchers will take part in the research. Thank you very much, dear friends. We have a few questions left, but we don't really have the time, unfortunately, and we need to take a break, and the audience that is what will happen, but we have already started talking about, well, I mean, the presenters have started talking about very important and large-scale questions. So the deaf culture is the thing that we're thinking about from the point of view of legislation, because it's a legal concept and it's a scientific concept and it has its own theoretical rationale, linguistic, anthropological, psychological rationale, and so it has its own ethics and epistemology. So the way we can get knowledge, and it's really important to have the co-participation and a multitude of points of view and perspectives and differences. So this is a kind of maze that we have started exploring during this plenary session. So we are now inviting you to travel more around the maze and find your own exits and entrances. So thank you very much to everyone who presented, who listened, who asked their questions. Thank you for your emotional support and your reactions. Thank you, everyone. So good luck during the next sessions, during the next modules, and the next few days of the conference.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now everyone can take their seats. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We begin the presentation of the first study of the research in the deaf community laboratory. Today, during the plenary session, we discussed a lot how we can produce knowledge about the deaf community, who is included in this deaf community, what the deaf community is. And it seems that this is the question we should start our discussion with, what the deaf community is. So we do it for the third conference running. During the first conference, we posed the question, what does it mean to be deaf? We address the core of this community, deaf people, and try to understand what it means being deaf. And now we moved on to the question, who is at the periphery of attention? That's the title of the conference. I actually didn't like the word periphery because it can be interpreted and understood in many ways. Sometimes periphery is something insignificant, but within the framework of the conference, the notion of periphery as it is understood in the notion of periphery vision, that's what we meant. What is not in the focus of our attention. Now I'm looking at the audience, I see the audience, and my colleagues, guys, are there at the periphery. For example, now I turn my head, and now my colleagues are in the focus of my attention. So within the framework of research in the deaf community laboratory, we were just turning our head to the right, to the left, trying to understand who is where within this community, and we realized that actually everywhere, wherever we look, we have someone. There are different groups, different subgroups within this community, and these relations between various subgroups are the subject of our research. Now I give the floor to the team. First, I'd like to introduce guys Polina Zdobnikova, Alona Gradnikova, Danila Chitverikov, and Alexander Zhurovets. And I'd like to remind you that now on the slide there was a QR code. Also, it's on the 5th page of the program. You can follow it and ask questions to the speakers, both during the presentation or afterwards, because after the presentation, we, as usual, will have a discussion. Thanks a lot, Nikita. I suggest that we finally begin our discussion. We can start sharing the results of this research. I wanted to begin with the fact that, as long as we understood, the deaf community does not only include deaf people, it includes other groups, hard of hearing, coda, cochlear implant users, hearing people, late deafened people, and so on and so forth. So, a person who is part of this community can take part in various interactions, in interaction with various groups, and express their attitude in different ways. When we say that a person is part of a community, he belongs to this group. And these groups also interact with one another, which influences the general structure of the community and defines it. And in our research is based on the desire to investigate the social structure of the deaf community. And there are not so many research on this topic. And we decided to make a contribution to this topic in order to investigate social structure. We have various methods and tools. And in this research, we used the notion of social distance. What is it? Let's try to understand step by step. To understand what social distance is, first I suggest to go back to 2020 when there was COVID-19 pandemics. And at that time, social distance was understood as, first of all, physical distance, when we had to keep distance of 1.5 or 2 meters between people. But social distance can be not only physical, but also psychological. And this understanding of social distance is basic for our research. If we treat this notion scientifically, it's the degree of proximity or remoteness between groups of people. And for the first time, this notion was formulated at the previous century, 1926, by American sociologist Emily Bogardus. And he tried to understand what the relations between Americans and other racial and ethnical groups in America at that time were. And he developed the corresponding scale to measure these relations. Today, social distance scale has changed. It was adapted, and in application to deaf and hard of hearing people, this scale was also used, but we need to specify that it was used in a specific context. For example, when deaf and hard of hearing people were considered together with other people with some impairments, and social distance was measured in relation to them, or when deaf and hard of hearing people are opposed and the social distance is measured in relation to hearing students. It's another context. But we decided to take a closer look at the community itself and develop and adapt the scale in a way so that we can take a look inside. Sorry? I want to warn the audience that, well, you will have a chance to share your opinion. That's why I need your hands and your opinion. And this tiny interaction will help us together understand what social distance is. Let's imagine there are 2 groups of people in front of you. For example, dog lovers, those who love dogs, and cat lovers, those who love cats. And my question is, which of these 2 groups seems better to you? Those people who feel like dog lovers, I ask you to raise your hands. There are lots of you, yes, thank you. And now those people who prefer cats and cat lovers. Yes, there are many of us as well. Here we can see various opinions and various attitudes towards different groups. Another example. In the same way, we can try to express our attitude to representatives of various ages. For example, some people think that elderly people, they like elderly people more. Others might think they incline towards youth. And that's how we try to use this closer and more remote attitude towards the deaf community, where we can choose and express our proximity towards, for example, the deaf, or towards the users of cochlear implants. And now let's discuss how we measured social distance. We had a set of questions which was dedicated to this specific topic. Each wording began with the words I would prefer a deaf person as, for example, the first option, my husband. And I think, yes, I fully agree with this statement. The next option, I would prefer having a deaf person as a friend. Well, yes, I'd rather say yes. The next wording, I would prefer having a deaf person as a colleague. Well, actually, don't know, something in between. We had 6 groups towards which we suggested such wordings. Let's take a look at one more example. I would prefer having a deaf person as my husband. I think I fully disagree with this statement. I wouldn't like to. Once again, these examples show us how this methodology was used in our questionnaire. But what does it mean when I say that I'd rather have a deaf person as my husband? It means that my distance towards deaf people is minimum. I know the representatives of this community quite well, and I say that I for sure don't want to have a deaf person as a husband. It means that I'm very distant from this group, that it's remote from me, and it shows my aspiration to avoid any contacts with this group. Now I'd like to give the floor to my colleague, Alana, and she'll tell us which groups we took into account and discussed.
Thank you, Polina. So certain groups have already been mentioned, but I will definitely give you a list of all the groups. So deaf people, cochlear implant users, hard of hearing people, deaf-blind people, and CODA, which means children of deaf parents, hearing children of deaf parents. I would like to highlight that in research, there is no clear view of which of these subgroups constitute the deaf community. That is why we decided to take a certain number of groups. So these are the groups that we took for our study, and it was really important for us to choose these groups. Also, those who took part in the study could identify differently, but I will talk about this a little later. So I will now talk about the design of our study. Polina has already mentioned social distance and the social distance scale, and the fact that it had been invented quite a long time ago. And so we needed to adapt it. We translated it into Russian and adapted it in accordance with the reality of the deaf community in Russia, so that the questions and the sentences we would have would be very clear and understandable to the participants of the study. And in order to make the scale more understandable. We talked about the wording of the questions, like how to say it better, how to make this question understandable. And so we had a methodological seminar at the High School of Economics University. After that, we reworked the questionnaire and we started collecting data. So I've already mentioned that we had a questionnaire. It was online. So we had a list of questions and we sent it around into different groups and chats online. So the questionnaire was active between April 20 and May 20. And as for the selection, it was created according to the snowball principle. So any person could become a participant. So just a random person who was in a group or in an online chat saw the link and they could freely take part. So we had over 300 respondents. So I will now talk about a typical respondent. Our typical respondent was a woman aged between 25 and 34 who lives in Moscow or in the Moscow region. So that means that we had more women than men, and most respondents were pretty young, and most of them lived in Moscow or the suburbs of Moscow, and not other cities. As for identification, we had a lot of answers, so over 30% of the respondents called themselves deaf, 31% hard of hearing. Well, you can see the most popular answers. There were also some respondents who chose the term a person with hearing impairment or a person with hearing disability or CODA or a hearing person and some others. So you probably wonder why we put these wordings here, like, for example, a person with hearing impairment or a person with hearing disability. That's not quite politically correct, right? Well, if a person calls themselves a person with hearing impairment, that person can be deaf or hard of hearing or a cochlear implant user. So what was really important for us is how self-identification or how people call themselves is connected to the level of social distance. As for other features that can be connected to social distance, there is a list. So before we got our data, before we got the answers from our respondents, we thought that social features might be connected to distance. So self-identification, sex, age, the region where the person lives. So I've already told you about an average respondent, so female, rather young, lives in Moscow or nearby. So let's say there are two respondents. One of them lives in Moscow and the other one lives in Krasnoyarsk, a city in Siberia. So we thought that where this person lives might be connected to the distance. For example, someone who lives in Moscow feels closer to the community, and someone who lives in Krasnoyarsk might feel more remote. What actually happened, what actually was in the answers, that's something we'll tell you later. So, as for other features, Dania will tell you about them. Dania, the floor is yours. So we thought that social distance might be connected to social characteristics, but cultural characteristics could also be something that has an impact here. So cultural characteristics means the level of acculturation, the level of immersion in the deaf culture. So we used the deaf acculturation scale. The term acculturation means the extent to which a person is willing to be engaged in the cultural values and traditions of the community, and also to have a linguistic identity. So this is a term that we used in our study. The acculturation scale was created in America, so we took it and adapted it to use it for the deaf community in Russia. So the questionnaire that has already been mentioned had several questions that had to do with acculturation. For example, there was a question, how do you identify yourself? To what extent do you know famous deaf people in the deaf community? Do you go to events of the deaf community? Do you read the books written by deaf people? Do you know the deaf history? So the questions were connected to deaf culture. There was another question. Do you feel confident when signing in Russian Sign Language, or do you think your level is not quite right? So, acculturation. The question is, who is more acculturated among the members of our team? So as a result, we saw two groups. So high acculturation people was the first group, and the second group was mid-level of acculturation. So we looked at the first subgroup, and we realized that a person with a high level of acculturation identifies himself or herself as a deaf person and calls themselves deaf. And there are usually relatives who are deaf. That can be parents, mother, father, or brother or sister. And this person probably studied in a deaf school, and his or her first language is Russian Sign Language. So this is all connected to acculturation of a person, the level of acculturation of a person. We also wanted to know whether acculturation is connected to social distance, and Sasha will now talk about that. So I will now talk about all the results that we got. And first I will talk about the average distance towards various subgroups. So when people talked about whether they are willing to be a friend or a colleague of a person from a certain group, we had a system of numbers. So it was between 3 and 15. So 3 means that the person is willing to communicate with all people, and 15 means that they answered no to all those questions. No, I don't want to communicate. So these are the average values. So the largest distance was towards deaf-blind people, 8 points. The next group is cochlear implant users. So this distance was larger than a distance from hearing people. So often people were more willing to interact with hearing people. As for the level of distance from hearing people and deaf people, it was almost the same number. The minimal distance was towards CODA, children of deaf adults, and hard of hearing people. So these are the two subgroups with which most people were very willing to communicate. So we took all the questionnaires, and sometimes we had all 3s, or sometimes people had higher points for all the groups. So we wanted to know what can be the reason here. I mean, because of different attitudes. So the first thing we thought about is the level of education. So the more educated the person was, the smaller the distance towards all subgroups. Another important point is identification. So the people who would call themselves, I have a hearing disability, actually had the largest distance towards all the subgroups. So a person had a medical approach and towards themselves and towards the community. And so that led to a large distance. And the next important factor is age. So the older the person, the higher this person's distance towards the hearing people. So it wasn't connected to other groups, only hearing people. And another interesting conclusion is about the level of acculturation. It isn't connected to social distance at all. That was actually surprising for us. So it doesn't matter to which extent the person is immersed in the deaf culture, to which extent they know the culture, to which extent they acknowledge it. It didn't really influence this person's attitudes towards the subgroups. So we can't have a cultural view of social distance. Social distance has other reasons. So to conclude, it's really important to point out that distance is very different towards different subgroups. This is actually one of the points that we wanted to check. So the smallest distance is towards hard of hearing people and CODA, and the largest distance is towards deafblind and cochlear implant users. So this can be actually a foundation for more research. The question would be, why is it so? Also, distance is a very systematic term. So if I have a large distance from a certain group, it probably is pretty large towards other groups. And the other way around, if I have a small distance from one group, then probably other groups would also be closer to me. So it's not described via culture. And so what are the features then? Social, cultural, psychological characteristics. This is something to look into. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for your attention, and we'll be happy to answer your questions.
Yes, thanks a lot. And I remind you about the opportunity to ask questions in our chat. To do so, you should follow QR code, which is printed in the program or that we showed you at the very beginning of the presentation. We won't be able to go back to the beginning of the presentation. That's why please check the program. I believe it's on the 5th page. And as long as everyone's thinking, we have questions. The first question is addressed to Alana, but I think that you all have something to say. Last year, there were less questions, 100, 150 approximately, for each research. And this year, it's 300 questions, but still it focuses on Moscow and, let's say, literary deaf people. Can we interpret the responses, given that many groups were not taken into account in this poll? Thanks a lot for this question. I believe it's a very important remark. In general, any scientific research is limited by the sampling. And it's hard to judge all the deaf and hard of hearing people about all the groups who were interested in based on this information. I think the fact that we claim the amount of respondents and show the percentage, these people are from this region, those from that, that's one of the limitations to our study. It's impossible to poll everyone, but it's important to take it into account because it works for no matter what research. I'd like also to comment. This year, we have lots of respondents, more than 300 people, because we had a mailing through Telegram channel, through various social networks, and we worked a lot to get more responses. And also there was a question in this poll that we researched various groups who identify themselves differently. It's true, we got responses like when a person is wearing hearing aids, he considers himself as a hard of hearing, but when he takes hearing aids off, he thinks of himself as a deaf person. Also, there are such responses. Everyone thinks I'm a hearing person, but I'm deaf. Person understand how he identifies himself and how he's identified by the others. There are always limitations. We only took a look at 8 groups. We were interested in all these responses. And I actually want to comment on this figure, 100, 150. Last year we had larger sampling groups, and you can take a look at the almanac. Either you have it with you or you can buy it in a bookshop of Guest 2. And the last year's research is published there. You can check the number of participants last year. And I move on to the next question. The question is high social distance to users of cochlear implants and deafblind people, whether it's connected with the lack of information about these groups or the fact that they are less visible, don't have contact with the deaf community. It's not what we investigated. We cannot answer this question because we never asked why you had such a distance to these groups. That's one of paths for further research, but actually the trends for these groups are the same as for any other group. If a person has knowledge about the community, probably they are ready to interact with a wider range of people. Why these groups are distinguished, it's hard to say. Thanks a lot. The next question, please tell us one more time what is a random sampling, snowball sampling. And Alana characterized this sampling as a sampling of people who, this and that way, are connected with the community. It's a very good question. Thanks for being so attentive. Well, my comment about the snowballing was connected with the fact that I need to explain what it means. What I meant, we created a questionnaire and distributed it through the channels connected with the community. We didn't send it to the public of car lovers or cat lovers, let's say. It was somehow connected with the community. For example, a chat for parents of kids who wear cochlear implants. Probably my colleagues remember some other examples of chats. That's the point. What Sasha said about the lack of connection with acculturation, that's true. It was an unexpected outcome. We send all the information to the necessary channels, which are linked to the community. The more they know about the community, the less the distance is. But we have such an outcome. Probably, Sasha, can you comment once again how we explain it? Well, there is no distance with social distance, and acculturation means that the groups where we send our materials, it doesn't mean that if a person follows these groups, it doesn't mean he or she is fully submerged in this culture. Probably they check the group once a month. They check like, oh, this is a research about food, and the research about their attitude to the deaf culture is not that important. Or otherwise, or probably the deaf culture is important for them, but they do not communicate with the community as such. These things are not connected directly. How could we distribute it? We didn't approach people in the streets, of course. We didn't ask them to fill out the questionnaire. That's true. Yes, and I wanted to add about the channels and resources we use to spread our questionnaire. I wanted to thank everyone who helped us, who helped to spread this research. It was very nice that people shared these materials, and our research was published on the Telegram channel Deaf and Voiced. Yes, it's actually quite an explicit advertisement. We have lots of questions here. Probably we won't have time for them all, but later you can ask these questions. One more question. Can we somehow describe the border between being part of this group and a maximum distance? Well, being part means that a person is part of this community, but the closest distance means he's not part of this community, but they are somehow connected with the members of this community. Well, probably I'll try to reinterpret this question because it seems very interesting to me. What's the difference, or can we say that the same, it's quite the same? Can we say that these things are different or they are the same? First thing, when a person is not part of this deaf community, and second option is when he has maximum distance from everyone. Is it the same or not? Yes, Sophia shows a thumbs up. I'll try to answer this question. Thank you, Sophia. I think we can take various approaches to answering this question. I think that we can say that respondents who got access to our questionnaire are that way connected with the community, whereas those who didn't have a chance to participate in this research might not know such a community as deaf community. They're not familiar with it. So it's one of the possible interpretations. And I think that not being included in this community, I think it's very responsible to say that someone is included and someone is not. For example, a chat for parents of kids with cochlear implants. Imagine I'm such a mom, whether I'm part of the community or not. We can have various responses, but let's imagine I fill out this questionnaire and I have a very huge social distance towards everyone. I don't want to interact at all. Well, it's a very huge responsibility to say who is included and who is not. If a person decided to take part in this research, he in this or that way is connected. Yes, we have lots of interesting questions here. Let me reformulate it a bit in the form of comment. For example, what would be interesting for further research? The attitude to deaf autistic people or some other cross groups. Probably we won't be able to discuss all the questions. We'll leave them for further discussion. Thanks a lot for everyone for this wonderful evening. Yes, and if you're not leaving immediately, not jumping off the chairs, not rushing away. So let us take a look once again at the interpretation. Thank you. I'd like to remind that tomorrow at 11:30 we meet here, not only at the Playhouse but also the classrooms and at the upper platform, to discuss questions that are no less interesting and important than today. Have a good evening and see you tomorrow.